I'm joined today by my colleague, David Litwin. He's a manager of external comms at Moneris. David, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Al.
Now, March is Fraud Prevention Month, and we have a big report on fraud numbers in Canada that we're going to talk about today. So let's start with, how big a problem is fraud in Canada?
Yeah, before we dive into that big question, we'll start with a little bit of context about what the report entails and some of the methodology behind the numbers that we're reporting on. So the source of our data in this report is reported fraud cases to Moneris. These are instances that merchants have brought to us. Our fraud team has helped investigate and resolve for these merchants. And by taking a look at these reported fraud cases, we get a really good idea of what types of trends there are in terms of fraud that they're experiencing and how these trends are evolving. By breaking that down, we can help give businesses really actionable pieces of advice on how to prevent different fraud.
Given that, then, what are the findings for this year?
When we take a look at the high level of data, in terms of the actual number of cases that were reported to Moneris, we actually saw a decrease in fraud year over year.
Oh, good.
So that decrease was about 15%. And while it shows that progress has been made, there's always more work that can be done.
Right.
And I think a question that arises from that statistic is, if fraud cases are down, should businesses still care about fraud prevention?
Right.
And the answer is absolutely yes. So we're taking a look at reported fraud cases, but when we do that, it's important to remember that a lot of cases go unreported. So more often than not, actual fraudulent activity is often higher than this data indicates, meaning it's always important for businesses to prioritize fraud protection. Protecting your business is just as important as growing it.
You make a good point, and I spoke with Amisha Parikh yesterday from MasterCard, and we talked about it then too. Oftentimes when you're a victim, or many people who are victims of fraud won't report it out of maybe embarrassment or shame that they're the only ones.
Another aspect of this too is that oftentimes there's a little bit of a delay in terms of when fraud cases are reported.
Yeah.
Some types of fraud are committed, and it takes a little bit of time for the merchant to realize that it's occurred and then report it and then act on it. But while there is like a delay and then not all cases are reported, taking a look at these fraud cases as well can still give us valuable insight into how these different trends are changing or how they're changing over time. And by looking at fraud cases as well, we can really unpack what best practices are effective in helping prevent certain types of fraud.
Now, the numbers you have are across Canada, nationally. What kind of variances do you see, like region by region?
When we take a look at share of fraud cases by the different provinces, you see the breakdown based on where people mostly live. That's not surprising. One of the things that is surprising, perhaps, is in some ways the lack of variation. Take a look at the most common types of fraud and the second most common types of fraud. Pretty universally, whether you're on the East Coast or the West Coast, Ontario or Quebec, the most common type of fraud that businesses are experiencing is called moto fraud.
Okay.
And then second to that would be types of fraud that take advantage of the refund process.
Right. So talk a bit about moto fraud. What does that mean? Like, what does moto stand for?
Moto stands for mail order telephone order, and it is a type of fraud that takes advantage of the chargeback system. So when we look at the data, it accounted for 62% of all reported cases in 2024. And that's a pretty significant statistic.
It's hard to believe people are still, giving their credit cards over the phone.
I know it is hard to believe, but fraudsters benefit from it. And it helps us unpack why this is such a common type of fraud. And it's because moto transactions are inherently risky. And that's because taking card details over the phone or by mail and then manually entering them poses a significant and high risk for chargeback fraud. Because if a cardholder disputes the charge completed via moto transaction, it's the business that's left with the loss, and there's nothing they can do to dispute it because they can't verify the purchaser of that transaction. What we would recommend instead, if you can't do a card present transaction, is to opt instead for a secure online payment gateway like Moneris Checkout. And that integrates with a variety of different fraud prevention solutions. A great one specific to this type of fraud would be 3D Secure. And transactions that are authenticated with 3D Secure shift the chargeback liability from the merchant to the card issuer, which further protects them from losses.
Okay. We have moto fraud. Is there another type of fraud that is prevalent that we should be looking for?
Yeah. So fraud is often a crime of opportunity, and an opportunity that fraudsters find is taking advantage of the refund process. So when we take a look at different fraud cases associated with anything to do with refunds, so that would be refund on stolen devices, general abuse of the refund process, or even employee-led refund fraud. Collectively, all of those different types of fraud account for almost 30% of all the cases that were reported. So it's a vulnerability that fraudsters like to expose if not properly accounted for. And we've seen in the case data that Cases involving the refund process also grew in share by 11% year over year. So it's one that's grown over time. And cases involving the refund process is also the second most common fraud type in many regions. So that would be Atlantic Canada, Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba. What businesses should keep in mind knowing this piece of information is that fraud related to the refund process is very easy to prevent and can be done simply by taking just small steps. One of the best things you can do is ensure you've applied passwords to the terminals that only authorized employees know, and limit access to the refund process by using the administrative restrictions on terminals, which are readily available.
Now, you'd mentioned stolen terminals, and that's one that's on a rise too. Terminal theft. How does that look? Why would fraudsters want to steal terminals?
There are layers to that, and it's a really interesting one to unpack and take a look at from a business perspective. So I'd mentioned that the refund process, they're collectively a bunch of different types. They account for 30%. The biggest one of that group of fraud types that are part of that refund fraud group is refund on stolen devices. So it isn't just the fraudster taking the device and the business experiencing the loss for the cost of that device. It's actually because the fraudster is taking the device and using it typically to reload prepaid cards through the refundability in terminals. Right. So it's that mechanism that leads to a more significant portion of the loss for the business. When we look at the case data for refund on stolen devices, the reported cases for this fraud type grew 3% year over year, and it now accounts for 16% of all reported cases. And that makes it single-handedly the second most common type of fraud that Moneris sees in Canada.
Now, you mentioned fraud as a crime of opportunity. I think back to how many times I've been at a restaurant and having the server just leave the terminal on the table because they're busy serving another table. I mean, there's your opportunity right there. So I guess that kind of outlines the importance of awareness, not just for the business owner, but also for employees.
Absolutely, yeah. So making sure your employees are aware of the different fraud types and the steps that they can take to be a part of your fraud prevention strategy can reduce the chances of fraud happening significantly. Yeah. Some great tips for business owners and staff is to simply avoid leaving terminals unattended. In the example you gave as well, if you're a restaurant owner, be present at the table during the transaction and observe it. While attempting to leave the device at the table and do something else, it does create a risk for terminal theft. Right. And it can be easily avoided by just being present and observing the transaction. In addition to that as well, while observing the transaction, some of the tips as well are to keep an eye on how the transaction is flowing. If it's taking longer than expected or there's extra buttons being pressed, it's often a good idea to intervene and to help out the customer just to ensure that there isn't something else going on with the tampering of the device. In addition, when you're closing up shop for the end of the day, it's a good idea to take inventory of your terminals, to monitor their condition and take a look for any, indications of tampering or damage. If possible as well, process transactions using your terminal in front of a security monitoring system. And then when you're closing up shop for the day, it's a good idea to keep terminals locked and out of sight.
Great tips. And I think number one tip though is to report it too, because I feel like as a business owner, if somebody took my terminal, be like, oh, that's a pain, but it's just a piece of hardware. But actually, the biggest risk is later on where they can process those refunds, and that could cost you big time.
The sooner you report a stolen device, the sooner we can help you with that stolen device. So a really, really critical thing is as soon as you notice a device has been stolen or lost, report it to your payment processor, because what they can do is they can remotely deactivate the terminal, and that helps prevent further loss, those significant losses from this type of fraud from occurring. And in addition, as you're contacting your payment processor, they can also provide guidance and help with other things. For example, help with filling out a police report to recover the device, as well as sending you a new device in the interim to keep your business operating smoothly.
All great tips. I think number one, awareness, report it right away. And obviously, there's some amazing fraud prevention tools available for our merchants to be able to mitigate some of that. David, if folks want to learn more about those tools and about anything else fraud related, where can they go?
So March is Fraud Prevention Month. We haven't made that clear enough already. And because of that, Moneris is running an awareness campaign on our website and across social channels. So feel free to check out the campaign we're running called What the Fraud. That will entail a lot of different tips and best practices, as well as solutions and everything a business owner would need to know with regard to what fraud entails and how they can combat it.
And I'll post links to all of that in the show notes of this episode. David, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.